All right, so this is my lecture to go with the PowerPoint called PowerPoint Hospers. John Hospers, who wrote an article that you hopefully read already, which you should read and then go take the quiz before you come back here. For those of you who are my students in the course now, as opposed to people who found this on YouTube and just interested in Hospers. But that's the name of the file for the PowerPoint, Hospers. But really, the PowerPoint is more about the three-part theory of knowledge, which goes back to Plato. Hospers uses it as part of his argument against skepticism. And I also mentioned a fellow named Lacewing, just a modern philosopher who wrote some stuff that I also have in my Dropbox that tries to clarify this threefold theory. So let's go down to the first slide. There's an opening quote by Einstein: "Imagination is more important than knowledge." And then there's just four pictures. One is a picture of a sailboat on the ocean, which is going to the edge of the ocean, which looks like the edge of a table. And it's as if water is suspended in the air in the shape of like the three sides of, or two sides of a table, right? The ship is up here and it's about to go to the edge, and there's just water, like, over there, for those of you who don't have the PowerPoint. And above it, it says, "Why is that true?" Which is about why is Einstein's quote true? Why is imagination more important than knowledge? Well, I like this picture of the boat about to go off the edge of the earth, because for centuries, human beings allegedly believed that the earth was flat. When they looked out at the ocean, I guess, they saw that, where the water met the sky, the horizon, it just might have been the edge of the earth. I guess they didn't go out far enough on boats to realize there comes a point where you can't see land and to figure out that there's a curvature there. Maybe just because you couldn't see that far anyway. Maybe telescopes helped that. No. It was Galileo invented the telescope, so that was after Columbus figured out that it probably wasn't a flat earth. But the diagram shows a boat approaching the edge of the ocean. And if you think about that, what would hold that water up like that? Water doesn't remain in the shape of a huge ice cube, where you go off the top plane, right? Go across the top and come to the edge and just fall off. What would hold that water on the edge up if there was nothing like the wall of a bathtub that could hold the ocean up, right? So, but then if there was like a kind of wall of a bathtub holding up the ocean, then the ship would bump into that wall anyway and wouldn't go over the edge. People just didn't think it through. And that picture shows how illogical it is to think that there's an edge of the ocean. When you reach it, you fall off, because if there was no tub-like wall holding the ocean up, the whole ocean would fall off and be gone in a second. So that's why imagination is more important. And there's another picture of a human being with gears in the mind, thinking. And there's a diagram also about thinking, where there's a question mark, and then you see the gears turning, and then there's a light bulb, which, well, the gears turning means that you're thinking about and analyzing the question in the first diagram, and then the light bulb goes off, meaning you figured it out, and then the last one is an exclamation point, which represents certainty or knowledge, right? So without imagination, we get very little knowledge, and in that one photograph, there's a man on the moon, right, which is the result of a tremendous amount of imagination leading to tremendous knowledge. Okay, so the question of Hospers, I suppose, is what is knowledge and do we have any? The skeptics tend to think that we don't have knowledge. But I think that Hospers and the skeptics have different ideas about what knowledge is. So let's go on to the next slide where it says Hospers setting aside forms of knowledge. Okay, so here's an interesting thing that philosophers do often enough when they're about to tackle a subject is to differentiate between that part of the subject matter that they are going to address, the part which concerns them in some topic, and then set aside those parts of the topic that they're not concerned with, right? And this also is just kind of defining your terms. There are different senses of or types of knowledge, right? So one of the first things that Hospers does is identify 3 different kinds of knowledge, right? And the reason that he does it is because he wants to focus on only one of them. And so the smart thing to do is to just note the other 2 types and then give your reason why you're not concerned with them. It's not that they don't matter or that they're not knowledge, but they're different kinds of knowledge. And by the time we hear what all 3 of them are, maybe we'll understand why it makes some sense for him to focus on only one. Although all 3 really do matter, it's okay to focus on only one. Okay, so the first one is number 1, knowledge how, which is skills. Knowing how to ride a bike or how to speak French or how to dance, how to record a YouTube video, how to use Blackboard as a course management system, and so on, right? That's a kind of knowledge, knowing how to do things, right? When you think about it though, like I know how to walk, but I don't really understand the mechanics of gravity. I don't remember. I took a physics class. It was great. I really understood it a long time ago. It's been a long time, and theories about how gravity works have gotten a little more complicated. All right. I know how to ride a bike, but I might not be able to articulate the actual principles of it, and so on. Okay, so that's one kind of knowledge. Second kind of knowledge is like knowing what or knowing who. Right? Knowledge what or knowledge who, or what you might call knowledge by acquaintance. Right? So, like, you might know what red looks like and be able to point to it, or what Professor Petty looks like, or what lemon tastes like, or what pain feels like. Right? Because you've been directly acquainted with those things. You've experienced them directly. Right? You've seen red and blue and tasted orange and lemon and so on, right? Many of those things involve direct perception, either with your sense organs or with your bodily sensations and things like that. Knowing what an emotion feels like, right? That's knowledge. That's not knowledge how. That's a distinct kind of knowledge. Like an infant might not have words or concepts, but it might be able to recognize the difference between red and blue, or hot and cold, or wet and dry, right? Without language whatsoever, even without concepts. Okay, number 3, knowledge that, so to speak. Knowledge that something is the case. Knowledge that blank. I know that blank. Right? What fills in the blank when you say, I know that blank? We call that propositional knowledge because what fills in the blank is a statement or a proposition. Right? A proposition is a fancy term that philosophers use for a statement. An assertion, something you assert or state or propose. Assertion, statement, proposition. Right? Like the cat is on the mat. 2 + 2 is 4. Today is Wednesday. Professor Petty is lecturing right now into the camera, and he will upload this to YouTube later on, and so on, right? So those things that fill in the blank, I know that blank, those are propositions. So this is called knowledge that, or propositional knowledge, knowing that something is the case. Okay, there are interesting overlaps, but Western epistemologists focus on only one of them, mainly, although recently the other two have become quite interesting now that Western philosophers are becoming much more open-minded and trying to really shake things up in ways by listening to philosophers around the globe who aren't Western philosophers. But can you imagine which one Western philosophers focus on and why? Right? In fact, the question why might even be a big clue. Because when you say, I know that X, or I believe that P, right? Right? You're saying what you believe. Then the question is, why do you believe that? Right? Now, you wouldn't say, why do you know how to ride a bike? Right? You would say, how do you ride the bike? You wouldn't say, why do you recognize red? Well, you could say that, right? It might be something different, like, when did you learn that that color is red, or something like that. But when it comes to propositions, you say, why do you think that that's true, right? That's what you believe. Why do you believe it? And what do you answer why questions with? Right? Why blank? Because, and then you give other propositions, right? And if you recall from your first writing assignment in the course, what and why, you give what you believe, that's your conclusion. You say why, those are your premises, your reasons why you believe that conclusion. And what and why together, or your premises and conclusions together, is an argument. Right? And arguments are composed entirely of propositions. We want to believe and cultivate knowledge about the conclusions, and that's why we bring in our premises or our evidence, because we're seeking to expand our knowledge that something is the case, our propositional knowledge, our knowledge of which propositions are true, right? Is 2 + 2 = 4, and so on. Is today Wednesday? Is that the cure for cancer? And so on. Okay, so that's why Western philosophers focus on propositional knowledge, because arguments are made out of propositions. And analyzing arguments, reasons for believing, does this support that? Is this true? Right? Do these statements logically lead to those statements? Right? Those are the main kinds of things that concern Western philosophers. We want to know what statements are true and why we should think that they are, why we should believe them. Okay, this is not necessarily the same focus in Asian philosophy. Well, let's say in Indian philosophy, or certain strands of Indian philosophy. Type 2, knowledge by acquaintance, right, is the beginning of propositional knowledge, right? You become acquainted with milk, right, and cheese and things like that. You see them, you taste them, you smell them, you feel them, you make cheese out of milk and all that stuff. This is knowledge by acquaintance, direct sensory experience of things. Out of that experience, you cultivate propositional statements like, you can make cheese out of this milk, right? And knowing how to do it, right? So know-how, number one, knowledge how, becomes your test for the idea that this is milk and this is cheese, and the proposition, the statement, the knowledge statement that milk can be turned into cheese, or you could make cheese out of milk. So it's a test on that theory if you allegedly know how to make milk turn into cheese, and you take this substance that appears to be milk and you turn it into cheese. So if your propositions work in the practical world, if they help you to function effectively and do things in the world of objects, where all the objects are the things that are the subject matter of all your propositions, right? If your statements about the objects and events and processes and causes and effects in the world support your skills, your know-how, your functionality, your effectiveness in the world, then that functional effectiveness is a kind of confirmation that your beliefs are true. Your beliefs are true because they work in the world, right? So your propositions are valid if they support your know-how. Your knowledge that is confirmed when it supports your knowledge how, right? But it all begins in knowledge by acquaintance, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching milk and stuff like that, right? So it's fascinating. That's another course. Trying to think of the name of, the history of philosophy, the complete history of philosophy, or something like that. Really great series of podcasts. One of the threads in the series is about Indian philosophy. Excellent if you're interested in this subject. All right, but for the remainder of our work in this course, which is introductory philosophy course, when it comes to epistemology, we're mostly going to focus on number 3, knowledge that, and that's what Hospers is interested in. And skepticism is the belief that we don't have any knowledge that, right? So the skeptic might deny that we have knowledge that this is a bicycle, even while he's able to ride it. He knows how to ride it. He can recognize it, right? He knows what a bicycle looks like and might know what it feels like to ride the bicycle. But those are not knowledge that, right? Even though, like, this seems like a big disconnect. If you own the bike, you ride the bike, you can recognize your bike, and you know how to, do wheelies on the bike, all that kind of stuff, then it seems to be that statements about the bike that are in proposition form, like a bicycle is a two-wheeled vehicle or whatever, that can do certain things, that those are things that you should be able to know, right? But skeptics focus on propositional knowledge because, I guess, out of the other things, that's the easiest thing to doubt. And for whatever reason, some people are philosophically drawn to skepticism, as you might have seen in Descartes' first meditation rather, right? When he says, if I can doubt something, then I don't know it. That's skepticism. He used skepticism to doubt all the things he wanted to get rid of, right? And keep math and science. But unfortunately, his skepticism was so strong that the kind of doubt that he embraced as the opposite of knowledge, that if you could doubt it, you don't know it. You can doubt math and you can doubt science and you can doubt his arguments for the existence of God and all sorts of things like that. So the monster of doubt that he let out of the box was almost his own undoing. And that's skepticism, doubting almost everything, believing that there's nothing that we know. All right, so Hospers is, in this paper, giving an argument against skepticism. All right, so we just set aside knowledge how and knowledge by acquaintance, and now we're focusing only on knowledge that, and that's propositions. I know that P, or I believe that P, where P represents a statement like the cat is on the mat, or I'm Superman, or something like that. Okay, so I want to remind you of our very first PowerPoint presentation when we said, what is a belief, right? Because beliefs come in the form of propositions. I believe that I can fly, or I believe that Clark Kent is Superman or something, whatever it is, right? So in this next slide here, it says at the top, belief, a thought you think is true, right? So remember this analysis, not all thoughts are beliefs, but all beliefs are thoughts. Which ones, which thoughts that you have are beliefs? Those thoughts that you think are true, right? Minimally speaking. And a thought is a picture, a map, a model in your mind about the world, right? And if you think it's true, you think that that picture, map, or model in your mind reflects reality. And truth, therefore, is a relationship between a thought or a claim, a belief, and reality. And what's the relation? This is all a reminder. We did this before. Matching, corresponding, mirroring, representing, representing. True belief, if the belief is true, you think it's true, and it is true, depicts reality as it is, correctly, or so you imagine. So we have a funny little picture on the slide here of a man standing on top of a mountain with a cape on, and a thought bubble shows him in his cape flying. And then in the next picture, there's a picture of him having stepped off the cliff, trying to fly, but falling down. Okay? So the second picture is the reality that he can't fly. And the first picture is the belief that he can fly. The second picture shows him acting on that belief and the world disconfirming that belief. Right? So this is a kind of really, there's a lyric in the 8 Mile song, whatever, by Eminem. Oh, back to reality. Oh, there goes gravity, right? Like, there goes gravity for that guy. Back to reality. He thought he could fly, but gravity told him otherwise, right? So this is a little comment here about beliefs can be false or true depending on whether or not the belief itself in your head matches the reality outside your head. And if you believe that you could fly, but you can't fly, then your belief is false. So, and a belief and an opinion are almost the same thing. There's some kind of slight difference between a belief and an opinion. An opinion might just be some kind of like a lukewarm belief or something. It depends on how strongly you hold the opinion. You think it's true on some level, so all opinions are beliefs. Whether or not all beliefs are opinions, I don't know. Slight difference. But I'm mentioning opinion because people say, well, that's my opinion, right? And everybody's entitled to their opinion, right? As if all opinions are equally valid. Well, this guy's opinion in the diagram, he's entitled to it. And then when he steps off the cliff, his entitlement falls off the cliff with him. And then when he crashes on the ground and his brains splatter out of his head, that might be the end of his belief, right? So I think it was a senator in New York. I forget what his politician in New York when I was a young man, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, once made a statement. He said, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but nobody's entitled to their own facts, right? So in the first picture there, the guy has the opinion that he could fly, but in the second picture, the facts are that he can't fly, right? So while you might want to be respectful of other people's opinions and their beliefs, it doesn't mean that they're all equally valid, or that you can't evaluate them and say these are more accurate than those, or these are more likely to be true, or these are true and those are false, right? In the second diagram, there's a picture of a brain, and in the brain is a kind of thought bubble that shows like a picture of a box with a little red ball in it and a garbage pail next to it. And outside the brain, you see a little box with a red ball in it and a garbage pail outside of it. So the second set of pictures, the brain and the two items, the box and the garbage pail, right? Those depict the relationship of truth. There's a belief in that brain that there's a box with a red ball in it and a garbage pail, a green garbage pail outside of the brain, and there is one. So the representation in that brain matches the reality outside the brain, right? That's the truth relationship. That belief is true, okay? So there's a difference between true belief and false belief. So the idea of what we call relativism, it's all relative. Whatever you believe, man, that's your belief. You do your thing, I'll do mine. It's a nice little hippie attitude, but metaphysically and epistemologically, the metaphysical reality outside of your mind determines which of your beliefs are true for the most part. Right? Like that, your belief that you could fly, the reality outside of your body that has gravity in it proves otherwise, right? So that belief is false, but the garbage pail and little box belief are true. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So true beliefs, they seem like a good thing, right? But are they knowledge? Now just remember, We've talked about this before. Not all thoughts are beliefs. I could have a thought that I could fly. I can entertain that thought and go, yeah, I can think it, but I don't believe it, right? Or I can think that Santa Claus is really an alien, and that's why he can fly around and give presents, and he's a Martian spy or something. All those little toys have bugs in them so that they're spying on human beings and the kids' toys. And I could have all those, I could entertain all those thoughts and think them without thinking that any of them are true. Right? But if I think a thought and I think that that thought is true, then that's a belief, right? So a thought alone is not a belief. It has to be a thought that you think is true. And you can figure that out just by analyzing and comparing beliefs and thoughts. Similarly, are true beliefs knowledge? Right? Just like maybe not all thoughts are beliefs, maybe not all true beliefs are knowledge, or vice versa. Right? So let's think about it. I mentioned this in one of the earlier PowerPoints, that when you watch a movie and you figure out, like, you know what's going to happen, that he's going to kill her or whatever, right? And later on, the movie shows that your hunch or your intuition or your guess or your excellent detective work or whatever it is was correct, that he does kill her. You're liable to blurt out, "I knew it!" Excuse me. But did I really know it? I had a belief. The belief turned out to be true. It was already true. The movie was filmed before I hit the play button and stuck the DVD in the machine, right? So the belief mapped onto reality. I thought he was going to kill her, and he did kill her, right? So that's a true belief. But did I know it? I mean, once they showed in the movie that he killed her, then you could say, I know it. So, but if that's the case, I can blurt out and say, "I know it," right? Well, whoop-de-doo. Of course, you know anything that the movie shows you to be true, right? But before it you discovered that it was true, right? It was true beforehand, but you didn't know if it was true until it was shown to be true, right? But it was true before you knew that it was true, right? So it seems like true belief might not be enough for knowledge. It seems like it's necessary, because you can't say that you know something that you don't believe, and you can't say that you know something that's false, right? You're just like mistaken. And there are certainly things that are true that you don't even think are true. So you certainly can't know them if you don't believe them. You don't think that they're true, right? And you certainly can't know that they're true if they're false, right? So it seems like knowledge requires true belief. Just like for a belief to be a belief, it has to be a thought. But being a thought doesn't guarantee that it's a belief. Similarly, knowing something, P, knowing that P, seems to logically require that P is true and that you have to think that it's true. For you to be someone who knows it, you have to think it's true and it has to be true. But are those two things enough? Just like being a thought is not enough for a thought to be a belief, it has to be something else, that you have to think it's true for it to count as a belief. Similarly, Plato said 2,300 years ago, true belief is not knowledge. You need more than mere true belief. And on the next slide, we'll discuss his groovy counterexample. So I think this might be the first time that I'm using the term counterexample. This is a term of art, one of the key terms in philosophy, just like the word contradiction is a key term in philosophy or in logic, right? Just like organism is a key term in biology, right? A counterexample is an example that contradicts a claim or a theory or a principle, right? It runs counter to the claim that it contradicts, right? Philosophers love counterexamples and contradictions. But when there's a claim that you have a doubt about, if you can think of even a hypothetical case that contradicts it, that's a possible counterexample. So the simplest thing, for example, one thing that philosophers like to use this example a lot is, if the claim is all swans are white. It only takes one swan that's not white. You say, look, here's a swan that's not white. Whether it's black, brown, yellow, green, blue, polka dotted, rainbow colored, it doesn't matter. If you show just one swan that's not white, that swan is a counterexample to the theory that all swans are white, right? So if the theory that we want to think of a counterexample to is that true belief is knowledge, right? What would be a counterexample to the claim that true belief is knowledge? If all swans are white is the claim you want to contradict, then you need to come up with a swan that's not white, right? So if the claim is true belief is knowledge, then you need to come up with what? An example of a true belief that does not seem to be knowledge, right? Like a swan that does not seem to be white. Okay, and Plato imagined such a case. Next slide. So his counterexample involved a crooked prosecutor. I'm going to embellish this a little bit, who, let's suppose, paid liars to get on the witness stand, right? Suppose the liars say, I saw it. One of the liars says, I saw the killing myself. I was, a little drunk. I had fallen asleep behind the garbage pails in the alleyway, and then I woke up and I was about to go home, and then I heard a rustling and I saw him stab her, right? And then another witness gets on the stand and says, yeah, he was in the cell with me bragging about how he killed her, how he stabbed her, right? And just embellishing on this, right? So suppose there's a whole bunch of paid liars who get up and claim to be giving good evidence that he killed her. And all of the evidence is lies. Nobody saw it. He didn't brag about it. Suppose that's all lies. We have a crooked prosecutor who wants this conviction, so he got those liars on there. But suppose that the guy actually did kill her, right? Now, think about the jury. The jury winds up, if it's really good evidence, and it seems like good claims and they're all coherent and everything. Suppose they form the belief. They go through their deliberations. They say, I believe he did it, right? So now they have the belief that he killed her, right? Unanimously, they come out with the verdict in no time. Guilty, right? And suppose it's true. He did kill her. Plato said, does the jury really know that he killed her? They believe it. Their belief is true. But they don't really know. That's just a lucky coincidence, right? Like the truth of the fact that he killed her has nothing to do with the reasons why they believe it. So it's just a kind of accidental convergence between their beliefs and the truth of their belief, right? And Plato said, that's not knowledge. Knowledge requires some kind of relationship between their beliefs and the truth of their beliefs. There needs to be some kind of an explanation or an account given of how the formation of their beliefs is directly related to the truth of their beliefs. There needs to be a really good, whatever that connection is, some kind of proper or appropriate connection between the truth of their beliefs and their having come to believe them. And that's absent in the case of the liars on the jury, right? The jurors coming to the belief, which happened to be true, has nothing to do with the truth, with the belief being true, right? It's being manipulated in ways that the jury doesn't even know, right? It's accidentally true, just like, and I put a picture in there, twice a day. That's why I put two pictures of a broken clock. You see the glass broken, right? Even a broken clock is right twice a day, as the saying goes, right? If you happen to look at that broken clock, just at the moment when it is the time indicated on the broken, frozen, dead clock, you will form a true belief. But if you don't know that the clock is broken, do you know that that's the time? That's a similarity to Plato's case, right? And I think the intuitive answer is no. So let's go on to the next slide. So you could call the theory that Plato just came up with a counterexample to the two-part theory of knowledge, the true belief theory of knowledge, or the bipartite, two parts, bipartite theory of knowledge, right, which Plato just critiqued, right? That theory, by the way, the two-part theory of knowledge, was obviously popular in Plato's day, 2,400 years ago, but it's still popular now among ordinary folks, right? I knew it, right? No, you didn't know it. You know it now. I know it, right? When the thing happens in the movie. True belief is not enough for knowledge, right? But the twofold theory of knowledge, or the two-part theory of knowledge, the true belief theory of knowledge, says knowledge is just true belief. That's all it is. If you have a belief and it turns out to be true, you knew. But Plato and other wise thinkers like you right now, after thinking about these examples, hopefully realize that true belief is not enough for knowledge, right? Okay, but now if it was, right, then somebody, let's say Socrates, let's just pick a philosopher's name, he knows that some proposition or claim or statement, remember we're doing propositional knowledge, some statement P, philosophers just pick the letter P like mathematicians pick the letter X to represent a variable for any number. P represents a variable for any proposition, which begins with the letter P, right? So the two-part theory of knowledge says that Socrates knows that proposition P is true if and only if two conditions are satisfied. One, P is true, and two, Socrates believes P. In other words, he thinks that P is true, right? So if those things are related, right, having a true belief, satisfying those two conditions, it's true and you believe it, and knowledge, if those are the same, knowledge on the one hand and true belief on the other hand, if they're equal, right, then you should be able to go in either direction from one to the other. But, right, so if you have a true belief, you have knowledge. If you have knowledge, then you have a true belief. But what I was reasoning with about a moment ago was like, if you have a belief, you have a thought. But a belief and thought are not equal. If you have a thought, you don't automatically have a belief. Something else is needed, right? You might want to make another comparison. If you're a brother, then you're definitely a sibling, right? But if you're a sibling, you're not necessarily a brother. But if you're a male sibling, then you are a brother. Male sibling is equal to brother. But sibling alone, one little criterion, is not equal to brother because that's a male sibling, right? So the arrow might go one way. If you're a brother, then you're a sibling. But if you're a sibling, you're not automatically a brother. Similarly, if you're a belief, you're automatically a thought. But if you're only a thought, you're not necessarily a belief. But if you're a thought that you think is true, then you are a belief. Similarly, if you have a true belief, you don't have knowledge, according to Plato. The arrow doesn't go from true belief to knowledge, but it does go the other way. If you know something, it has to be true, and you have to think it's true. Otherwise, you don't know it. All right, so let's move on. Next slide. So this is kind of repetitious a little bit over here, but I want to drill it in. Socrates knows that P, if and only if. Socrates, it says Sam up there. That's a typo. I guess I went from Socrates to Sam, or from Sam to Socrates and forgot to make it uniform. It happens a couple of times on the page, but let's just use all Socrates here. I'm going to fix that PowerPoint. Socrates knows that P, if and only if Socrates believes P and P is true. Right? And I'm saying this again because I want to emphasize this thing about if and only if. Right? What if and only if is a kind of if-then statement in both directions. Right? If P then Q, and if Q then P, going back the other way, right? If P then Q, and if Q then P. Right? So you got arrows going both ways, so you have like an equal sign with arrow pointers on both ends. That's the if and if, or one bar with the you know, the V at the end, right? If you have the PowerPoint, then you know the if and only if sign is a bar, like an arrow with arrowheads in both directions, right? if and only if. That means if the first thing is true, the second thing is true. And if the second thing is true, then the first thing is true, right? As opposed to just an arrow going one way, right? If something is a belief, then it's a thought. But it's not also an arrow going back from thought to belief, right? So that's, you don't say if and only if. You wouldn't say a thought, something is a thought if and only if it's a belief, right? That's a mistake. Right? But you could say something is a belief if it's a thought, right? Because beliefs are all thoughts, but not all thoughts are beliefs. Okay, so we want to make this is a logical distinction that's similar to equal and not equal, right? So this is part of that, but that's not necessarily part of this, that kind of thing. The arrow only goes one way, all right? So if Socrates knows that P, then 1 and 2 are both true. Statement 1, P is true. Statement 2, Socrates believes that P, right? And vice versa. If those two statements are correct, 1, P is true. 2, Socrates believes P, then Socrates knows that P. That's the if and if theory. That's the true belief theory of knowledge, that the arrow goes both ways. They're the same. If you have one, you have the other. If you have true belief, then you have knowledge. If you have knowledge, then you have true belief. But Plato says, no, it only goes one way. If you have knowledge, you have to have true belief, but not the other way around. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so it looks like this slide is a little repetitive. Yes, it is repetitive. So let's just, if you want to take a minute on your own to look at that, there's nothing new on that slide. I guess I said a lot of it already in the earlier version of this when I was telling the whole story. All right. Okay, so that was just maybe a summary of why, right? That the jury doesn't really know, even though they have a belief that's true. Okay, so now we get to the tripartite or threefold or three-part theory of knowledge, which has lasted from Plato's day right up into the 20th century. It didn't get any really serious criticism until around, I think, the 1960s or 70s, when a fellow named Edmund Gettier came up with what seemed to be a counterexample to the three-part theory of knowledge. I'm not sure about the Gettier thing, so I'm not going to make a big deal out of it now, but we will talk about it a little later. All right, but Hospers completely accepts the threefold theory of knowledge. And so does that fellow I mentioned earlier, whose name is on the first slide, Lacewing. Right, and if you want, I suggest that you read the article by Lacewing it's a short one, in the Dropbox, because he really develops the not only the threefold theory of knowledge, but he entertains the Gettier counterexample to it, and he comes up with his own version of this kind of a counterexample that I think is more intuitive and easier to understand as a counterexample than Gettier himself. And I think we might have to talk about that later. All right, but the third thing that Plato had added was, Plato said, some kind of an account of why your belief is justified by the fact that your belief is true in some way, shape, or form, or was caused by it, or is directly related to it in some way, right? Like if you saw the killing yourself, then that might be good enough justification for how and why your belief that he did the killing is related to the truth of the fact that he did the killing, right? Because you directly perceived it. So your perception of it is what caused the belief, right? Now that's a good connection between why you believe it and why it's true, right? And if you give an account of that relationship, then Plato says you have justified your belief, right? Although he didn't use that terminology, he said you've given an appropriate account of how your belief connects with the truth of your belief, right? So there needs to be that kind of reliable connection, which is absent in the case of a broken clock or a jury that had professional liars, right? So, but the three-part theory says knowledge is justified true belief, right? It was already two things were true belief, and we just add justified true belief, right? So for Socrates to know that P, 3 conditions need to be satisfied. The first 2 that we had before. Number 1, P must be true. It has to be true or else he can't know it. 2, he has to think it's true. He must believe P. Otherwise, he doesn't know it. If he doesn't think it's true, how could he know it? And 3, he must have some sort of an account of why he believes that P is reasonably related to P's being true. Most philosophers call that third condition justification. Socrates' belief that P must be justified, supported by evidence, reasons, perception, whatever, right? So that's the 3-part theory of knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. Okay, so there's a philosophical question about justification that might have come to your mind already if you're a philosophical thinker. How much evidence must Socrates have for his belief that P to be justified? Whatever the belief is, right? Well, we just studied Descartes, who in Meditation 1 is an incredibly powerful skeptic who says, if you can doubt something, you don't know it, remember? So for something to be justified, it must be incapable of being doubted. It must be undoubtable or indubitable, right? So justification requires indubitability, the inability to doubt something. Right? If you can doubt P, then you don't know P, remember? Knowledge is certain, doubt is uncertain. You can't be certain and uncertain about the same thing at the same time. That's a contradiction. Right? So if you can entertain a doubt, you don't know it. So Descartes' criterion for justification is the strongest one that there is. And the skeptics like that. It's doubt. Right? It's like the thing, for it to be knowledge, you can't doubt it, right? It's not just, it's beyond the shadow of a doubt, right? We have that phrase in the law, right? Problem is, we can doubt just about anything, right? And Descartes' attempts to wiggle out of his own doubts, most philosophers after Descartes think that he failed. Like his skepticism was better or stronger than his attempts to get around his own skepticism and build a house of knowledge on solid foundations, because you can even doubt the foundations, which I didn't talk about when we did Descartes, but I'll mention it now. I think, therefore I am, right? But modern neuroscientists and ancient Buddhist philosophers question whether or not there's even a self. I think, therefore I am. You can doubt the self. You can clearly doubt the self. You might not be able to doubt mind or consciousness. Mind or consciousness are present when they're present. But what's an I? Not an eyeball, the letter I. Me, a self. Buddha and the modern philosopher David Hume, who was a relatively contemporary with Descartes, and may have heard about Buddhism when he was at Descartes' college, La Flèche, in France, doing research, because there were Buddhist books there that Jesuits had just brought in from Asia while Descartes was there. I'll do it the way Hume says it. When I look within, I don't see a self. I see thoughts, emotions, perceptions, sensations, desires, itches, twitches, vibrations, memories, etc. I don't see any one thing that remains unchanged throughout the series of those mental phenomena that holds them all together. The way the Buddha might put it is, those are all like pearls that come one after another and look like a string of pearls, but there's no string holding them together. It's just one moment of consciousness after another, and it's constantly changing and flowing like a stream. Right? So, but there's a self would have to be some kind of part of you, some kind of mental part of you, conscious part of you that endures throughout the series of all your consciousness episodes without itself changing at all. And David Hume said, I don't see it when I look within, when I introspect, which is kind of like meditation. And that's what the Buddha claimed, that upon deep, deep, deep meditative analysis, he couldn't find any self and concluded there is none, right? So when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, Buddha and Hume both can doubt that there's an I, in the I think. And according to Descartes, if you can doubt it, you don't know it. So he can't know that he as an I, a self, exists. I think, therefore I am. No, thinking occurs, therefore existence occurs. But I think, therefore I am, not necessarily true. And everything else that Descartes argued in his subsequent attempts to build the foundation, solid foundations for his first new philosophy in the House of Knowledge, failed, right? So that's what the skeptic loves, this kind of thinking. For whatever reason, the skeptic says, yeah, I'm with Descartes. We can doubt everything, so we don't know anything, right? So remember, we're talking about the threefold theory of knowledge. It has to be true, you have to believe it, and you have to have justification. And Descartes, unfortunately, although he wanted to prove that we have knowledge, he came up with the criterion that for something to count as knowledge, it can't be doubted, right? But almost everything can be doubted. Even Descartes' brilliant attempts to kind of escape from doubt, right? So that's the strong arm, that the stronghold that the skeptic has. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So Descartes' argument, Hospers' argument against skepticism, he doesn't mention Descartes, but I'm applying it to Descartes because Descartes is the kind of brilliant example of a skeptic that you guys have studied. All right, so you know about Descartes. So we're on the next slide that says Hospers' argument against skepticism. And the first bullet says Descartes' criterion for justification is too strong, right? Indubitable. It has to be undoubtable. If that criterion, like that's his criterion for justification, undoubtability, right? If that criterion is the correct criterion for justification, for your beliefs to be justified, then we know almost nothing at all because we can doubt almost everything, right? But Hospers has the kind of attitude, and he's arguing from a premise where it's like, wait, we clearly do know a lot more than nothing. There's plenty of things that we know, right? Like almost nobody's really taken in, even if you found that philosophically interesting and puzzling and mind-blowing, you still believe that you know a lot of things, right? So we do think that we have an awful lot of knowledge about medicine and physics and engineering and technology and all sorts of different things that we know. Right? So if we're right about that we do have some knowledge, then the criterion that, when applied, suggests that we have no knowledge, that criterion must be wrong because it doesn't fit with the data. The data is, there's an awful lot of knowledge that we have. So if your criterion about how it is that that's knowledge fails to capture all the stuff that we think is knowledge, then your criterion is bad. Your criterion is too strong because it rules out everything that we think is knowledge, right? Now, reasoning in the flip side, right? Like this is one thing that philosophers like to do. Critical thinking suggests try to think of things from the opposite angle, right? If your criterion is too strong, then it suggests that we don't know anything. But if your criterion is too weak, too generous, right? Too generous in giving out alleged justification, right? Then having almost any kind of reason for thinking anything was true would convert that thought into knowledge, right? If doubting at all, having a doubt at all, defeats the claim that something is knowledge, right? And then that approach is too strong, the criterion, doubting as your criterion is too strong, then having a weak, the opposite criterion would be like, well, it's like, if you can have one doubt, then you don't know it. Well, then the flip side is you could have 99% doubts, but if you could have 1% of a reason to think that something might be true, then that's knowledge, right? And that's a mistake too, because then everything we ever think would be knowledge, right? Because the mere fact that, look, what did I say in the very first lecture? Our minds are truth vanes, weather vanes, truth detectors, reality detectors. So if a thought occurs in my mind, somehow or another, my reality detecting mind generated the thought. That's a reason to think it might be true, because the mind is a truth tracker, right? So just the mere fact that a thought occurs to anyone, the most ignorant, moronic person in the universe, has an opinion, it must be true. They have, not only that, it's knowledge. If your criterion is the opposite of Descartes, right? If you have any reason to believe it might be true, it's knowledge. Whereas Descartes, on the other hand, if you have any reason to think it might not be true, then you can't know it, right? So this is like the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? But both of them are wrong, because if Descartes was right, we know nothing at all. And if, let's say, the gullible criterion, like some kind of extremely weak, gullible, generous criterion, epistemological criterion for justification was correct, then we would know everything we ever think. And that's absurd. We don't know everything, and we don't know nothing. So we can't have a criterion for justification that's either too strong or too weak. It's got to be somewhere in the middle. And that's Hospers' approach. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so Hospers will summarize the reasoning that we just did, because it went by pretty quick, but I've got bullet points for it. If your justification, your criterion for justification, remember, this is the justified true belief theory of knowledge. Knowledge is a belief that's true and that you have justification for, and it has to be true. It has to be true, you have to believe it, and you have to have justification. Well, we're saying, how do we understand what counts as justification? That's the justification. That's all we're talking about right now, right? We narrow it down. We're not talking about know-how. We're not talking about knowledge by acquaintance. We're talking about propositional knowledge. And that seems to involve three things. It has to be true. You have to think it's true. You have to be justified. Now, what's your criterion for justification? Descartes' criterion, indubitability, that's too strong. If it was correct, we'd know almost nothing, which is false, so it can't be correct. Next one, if your criterion was too weak, like we can call that the gullibility, right? The gullibility view of justification, then we would know almost everything or everything. And that's also obviously false, in which case having a too gullible or generous or weak criterion won't work, because neither of those capture the data. There's a certain amount of knowledge we have, and there's an awful lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we do know and a lot that we don't know. So if we're going to get it right, that's the data. Whatever our criterion is, it has to at least generate the stuff that we think we know, right? Unless it has to prove that we're wrong about the things that we consider knowledge, right? So Hospers reasons there's got to be a midpoint between criterion that's too strong and a criterion that's too weak, right? Between absolute, undoubtable proof and like the slightest little reason for thinking something at all. And what is that? It's some kind of adequate or correct amount, some appropriate amount or type of evidence and reasons, right? That criterion in the middle has to be correct, because we do know a lot, and when we do, we have enough good evidence, right? Sometimes we have absolute proof, right? But we don't always have to have that to have knowledge, right? But Hospers says, look, knowledge comes not only just knowledge how and knowledge by acquaintance, but knowledge that, propositional knowledge, even that comes in many different kinds under different contexts and circumstances. I mean, just think about the knowledge that a doctor has and the knowledge that a veterinarian has, right? A veterinarian is like a doctor for multiple species, right? So they have different kinds of knowledge. What counts as knowledge in veterinary school is going to be different from what counts in medical school, right? And that's going to be different from what counts maybe in a physics class, right? Or in a big accounting firm in terms of the rules, general principles of accounting and stuff like that, right? Or on a witness stand in a murder case, like in the O.J. Simpson trial or something like that. By the way, I just saw the movie about that, in this Versace something or other thing. It was a series really about it. It was really interesting. Made me think twice about the case, right? But like, you know, it depends on the context. How much evidence you need is relative to the kinds of claims that you're making, right? So Hospers says it's hard to specify an exact amount as enough, because different contexts call for different kinds of evidence and different degrees of it, right? So you have to leave the criterion for justification flexible and contextual, meaning it's relative to the context, right? If you're in a murder case, the burden of proof on the person being accused of murder, or the person accusing someone of murder, the state or whatever, is very high, right? Because if you get that wrong, the person dies wrongful death. That's not fair, right? If they get executed and they didn't commit the crime. Whereas a parking ticket, there's an assumption that, the meter, blah, 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 that's a minimal amount of evidence that puts the burden of proof on the person whose car it was to show some evidence that there's something wrong with the ticket or something like that, right? High standards, low standards, they all vary from case to case, standards of evidence, even within the law, right? And in fact, both of those examples are in the law, parking tickets and murder cases, right? They vary. And so Hospers says we have to use common sense and the knowledge and the expertise that governs each different domain differently, right? Like scientific knowledge as opposed to mechanics knowledge working on your automobile, right? So let's move on to the next slide. So Hospers uses a couple of common sense examples. One is of an inflamed appendix diagnosis, right? Now, the doctor's not 100% sure at first. And, but his judgments are based on the symptoms that the patient is displaying and the doctor's knowledge about what the probabilities are depending on how many of those symptoms on the checklist the patient's symptoms satisfy. Right? And that knowledge about the probability relationship between the number of symptoms on the checklist and the likelihood that the person has an inflamed appendix is based on previous observations and experiments where you cut out appendices and these were the symptoms beforehand, and this appendix, they cut you open, they find out that it is inflamed, and then they find out that it's not inflamed, and they keep records of all that, and that becomes medical knowledge, right? So prior to opening you up, cutting you open, the doctor will go through a kind of checklist, which I've got about a half a dozen, 6 or 7 bullet points there of what the symptoms are. And I don't know how many of them a patient has to satisfy for a doctor to say, that's enough. There's a good probability that you have appendicitis, which justifies me cutting you open. Now, in case you don't know, if you do have an inflamed appendix and you don't remove it within a period of maybe just even a few hours, you die from a poisoning that leaks out into your body, right? So it's important. So that's the standard of evidence right there. So there's a list of these criteria: dull pain near the navel or the upper abdomen that moves, gets sharp as it moves to the lower right abdomen, loss of appetite, nausea and or vomiting soon after the abdominal pain begins, abdominal swelling, fever of 99 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, inability to pass gas. I apologize for that one, but it's a medical fact. It has nothing to do with me and my, political incorrectness by mentioning that. All right, so think about it. The doctor doesn't know, but he has good reason if enough of the items on the list are checked. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, Hospers says, suppose that the patient displays enough of the things so that medical wisdom says that's probably that's reason enough to think that the appendix is inflamed, and surgery to go see if it is, and if it is to remove it, is in order. Right? Hospers says, if I was a doctor, can I doubt that the appendix is inflamed? The answer is yes, of course. Right? I mean, look, it's not an issue. No doctor in the history of medicine has ever paused when he or she was about to make that choice and said, can I doubt the appendix is inflamed? I can doubt it, so I don't know it, so I shouldn't act. In fact, maybe my mind is under the control of an evil demon. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm just a simulated being. I'm an avatar in some kind of experiment. Right? No doctor thinks that. That would be insane. Right? Unless the doctor's also a philosopher and a weirdo. Right? We might think about it as a joke, but he wouldn't seriously entertain that question while he was in the role of your diagnostician and your doctor, right? The only issues that he really could or should be thinking about, if he's sane, is about the kinds of things that you see on these TV shows like Grey's Anatomy and House and all these other shows where, it happens all the time that these symptoms that the patient comes in with indicate this, and then they treat you for that, but you only make the problem worse or something like that, because there's some rare disease that satisfies those checklists, but only 1 in a million people ever get that. And then this particular guy was exposed to toxic, something or the waste or whatever. And, right, that's the kind of thing, right? That's the only kind of thing that doctors think about. But they still have to do what they have to do, and then they find out, right? So there's enough knowledge about probabilities and statistics and appendixes to perform the surgery, to open them up. So then Hospers says, okay, so the patient satisfies the checklist, which warrants the surgery. The doctor cuts him open, sees the appendix that's inflamed, cuts it out, right? Holds it in his hands. Does he not know that the appendix is inflamed? He can entertain the possibility that he's a brain in a vat or something like that, or that he's the subject of some bizarre Martian experiment on human beings or something like that. And he's in some kind of simulated fake world or whatever. Yeah, he can entertain those hypotheses. But are they reasons, are those doubts, are they the kinds of doubts? They're merely speculative possibilities. Are they reasons for him to be uncertain that the appendix in his hands, the inflamed bloody appendix, is in fact an inflamed bloody appendix? Hospers says, no, absolutely not. And I think my way of justifying Hospers' argument would be to say this. Being able to entertain a hypothetical possibility under which you could have the belief that you have and be wrong about it is not the same thing. That's intellectually curious and interesting and worth thinking about. As just anything else in philosophy is worth thinking about. But that's not the same thing as actually having evidence or reason for thinking that you actually are being deceived. Right? Big difference. Those are not the same things. Right? So I think what Descartes, or what Hospers should say to Descartes is, not only do you need a reason to believe something, right? When the justified true belief theory, yeah, you have to have, you think it's true, and you have to have good reasons for thinking it's true in order for you to have knowledge. If you have enough good evidence and reasons for thinking it's true, then you do have knowledge, if it is in fact true, in the right kind of way, that your reasons for believing it's true are appropriately related to the fact that it's true, right? That's fine. So your knowledge needs to be related in the right way, but your doubts also need to be related. Your doubts need to be justified in order for them to count as grounds to undermine your knowledge claim. Your doubts have to be grounded in evidence. You have to have good reason. You have to have justification for thinking that your doubts are actually applicable in some way in this case. Right? So this is, I think, a very clever way that Hospers is going about it. But he doesn't say it the way I just did. But I want you as students to remember this as a way to ward off skepticism when you get people use it to try to just undermine things that you think you know, if you have in fact knowledge, right? Doubt alone is not good enough. The doubts have to be rationally grounded in facts. And there has to be evidence and justification and reasons for the doubts to count as applicable and valid. Otherwise, they're just hypothetical possibilities. Yeah, maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm just a figment in your imagination, and when you wake up, I'll cease to exist or something like that. So what? That's a mere maybe. Maybes aren't evidence. All right, let's move on, because we're not done yet. Okay, more problematic example. All right. This is a remote class, right? So I like to talk about this in my office or in my classroom down the hall from my office. I know my bookcase is in my office because I think it's there. I just saw it in my office. It's always there. It's been there for 25 years. This is Hospers' example. My office is just down the hall. I heard and saw, I'm embellishing this. He doesn't say all these things, but some of them. I heard and saw no work crew nearby. I didn't order a new one. The door automatically locks when I leave. I check it periodically. It's working. I have no valuables in my office or any reason why anybody would go in and steal a whole bookcase. And my books aren't valuable either. Right? And suppose it's true that my bookcase is in my office. I have a true belief, right? It's true. I think it's true. And I have all those good reasons for thinking that it's true. And no good reasons to doubt it. So I know that it's there. In fact, I know right now, and I'm home, right? I'm miles away from my office, and I haven't been there in a few days. But I know that my bookcase is still there. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Maybe, I don't know. So Hospers considers the pros and cons. He wrestles, right? He gets down and dirty with the skeptic here. Skeptic would say, well, isn't it possible that high-tech burglars removed it? If you don't know that they didn't remove it, then you don't know it's in your office. Your justified belief doesn't guarantee the truth, right? You don't know that it's true. You think it's true. You have good reasons for thinking it's true, but it could be false, right? You know, you might be an innocent professor, but maybe the office mate that you share the office with, that part-timer that, you know, doesn't have his own office, and you let him use your office on the 2 days a week that he comes in, maybe he's like that guy from that show Breaking Bad, you know, that high school chemistry teacher who was boiling and cooking up drugs and, you know, had millions of dollars worth of drugs and money. You know, maybe he hides it inside. He's hollowed out your books and he keeps his drugs in the books that he knows that you never look at anymore, right? And they broke into you and they didn't have time to go looking through the books, so they just took the whole bookcase, right? Now, Hospers doesn't entertain that particular thought, but he entertains the possibility. The skeptic says, look, it could happen that something came about where your bookcase is not in your office. He doesn't go into all those details. I'm going through it just to try to make it a little more interesting, right? But the reply, which it says on the slide, right? The slide is Hospers considers the pros and cons. We just heard what the skeptic says. And now reply, it's possible. But it's so improbable that it doesn't undermine my justification at all. It's just a hypothetical possibility. It's a mere maybe case. Like maybe I'm a brain in a vat. So what? It doesn't count. You need evidence to ground your doubts. My justification stands. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Skeptic says, oh, okay, but suppose it's false. Suppose the bookshelf is actually gone. You can't distinguish between it's being true or false that the bookshelf is there, when in both cases, all you have in your head remains the same. You think it's there, and you have the same reasons for thinking it's there in both cases. But your two cases, there's two worlds, two possible worlds. In both of them, you think it's there, and you have the same good reasons for thinking it's there. But in this world, it's there, and in this world, it's not. And nothing in your head, which is the same across both of those worlds, can tell you which world you're in. So if you can't say for sure why you're in this world and not this one, you're in the world where it's true and you're not in the world where it's wrong, then you don't know. And that's a pretty good comeback from the skeptic, right? So here's the comeback from Hospers. And I don't know how convincing it is. If you've fallen under the sting and the spell of Cartesian skepticism, you know, from Descartes, Cartesian, like Cartesian coordinates that he invented, then you might really start to side with the skeptic. And it happens to people, right? Skepticism is very powerful when you really get it. So, but here's Hospers' reply to this. This was a stronger comeback from the skeptic. True. I may not have direct access to the truth about my bookcase when I'm not in my office, right? But against the skeptic, sometimes I'm in my office, right? Now pause for a moment. Can the skeptic undermine my knowledge that my bookcase is in my office when I'm in my office, looking at it, taking books out of it and whatnot? And leaning my coffee on it? I don't think so, right? So one essential criterion, this is the thing that Hospers also says, one essential criterion of knowledge is the truth factor, right? the bookshelf must be there for me to know that it is there. Right? It must be true that it's there. Otherwise, you're right. I can't know. If it's false, then I'm simply mistaken. And that does sometimes happen. Sometimes we think we know, but we don't. Right? I need not know that I know P in order to know P. Right? And I could be wrong. Sometimes we're wrong. Even science, we discover that, well, we were wrong about that. And now we have better reasons for thinking this newer thing, which includes the knowledge of the previous thing. Right? That's the way that science works, right? It's not inflexible and unrevisable. In fact, by definition, it's revisable in principle based on better evidence, right? So then the skeptic, that's when the skeptic, will dig his heels in and say, well, I'm sorry, the two-part ways, the skeptic and the believer. The skeptic says, if you can't distinguish between the two worlds and what's the same in your head across both worlds is that you think it's true and you have good reasons for thinking it's true, but you can't differentiate between whether or not it's true or false, then you don't know, except maybe when you're in your office, right? Most skeptics won't even admit that. They'll try to come up with some kind of brain in a vat or other kind of skeptical hypothesis to undermine even that, right? Like arguments about you can't know what's going on outside your brain and your mind. You can't get out of it to check and compare that with what's going on inside your mind, like Nagel brought up in your first reading. How do we know anything, right? It's the same skeptical idea, right? All right, let's go on to the next. I think this is the final slide. Let me just check one moment. Oh, no. It's the final slide directly about Hospers. So conclusions and takeaway points is the name of this slide. So this is more like a summary. The Cartesian criterion from Descartes of indubitability fails. It's too strict or strong. If it was correct, we'd know almost nothing. Sorry. P.S. We can doubt the criterion of indubitability. Therefore, the criterion refutes itself. Right. I forgot about that. Right. We can doubt. Hospers has given us reasons to doubt the criterion of indubitability, right? We've given reason to think that criterion doesn't work. It's too strong. So we've raised a doubt about that criterion, so we don't know that that's the proper criterion, right? So the criterion kind of eats itself. It's self-defeating in that way, right? But we do know plenty of things, right? That criterion is wrong because it says we know nothing, but we do know plenty of things, right? Thus, the criterion is incorrect. And I put over here, P.S. modus tollens. That's the name of an argument form in Latin, which means the mode of taking, where you take away and you negate the then part of the if-then statement. If P, then Q, a little squiggly in front of the Q means not Q, thus not P, right? If this implies that, but that's false, then this must be false, right? That's that argument form. So, if indubitability was correct as the criterion for justification, that implies that we know nothing. But it's not the case that we know nothing, therefore the criterion is false, right? So that's that kind of argument. On the other hand, a gullible criterion, which is when you have any reason to think something might be true at all, the mere fact that it occurred in your mind is a reason, that fails also because it's too weak or lax. It's too liberal, open, generous about what counts as knowledge. If that was correct, we'd know everything we ever even think. But we obviously don't, so that criterion also fails by the same argument form. If it was correct, it would fail. So, I don't want to repeat that. So Hospers' criterion is a midpoint criterion in between too much or too strong and too weak of a criterion, where we know nothing or we know everything, right? There's some things we know, there's some things we don't, and that is in the middle. It requires the right amount of evidence of the right kind in the right kinds of cases, right? Neither too strong nor too weak. The amount and type are relative to the context. This criterion seems to match the amount of knowledge that we actually have. So there's that kind of what we call reflective equilibrium. There's a balance. There's an equation like the criterion equals the knowledge. Remember the equal sign? Right? So the criterion seems to give us the same quantity. It equates with the amount of knowledge that we have. We don't know everything and we don't know nothing, but we do know a lot. Skepticism is doubting without adequate evidence for the doubts. That's me, I'm adding that, but I think Hospers would agree. He just didn't articulate it that way, but I think that's a really good way of putting his argument into a stronger format. Skepticism is doubting without adequate evidence for the doubting. Okay, now Lacewing and Gettier, those two other people, right, remember? Now, Lacewing is just kind of summarizing the Gettier counterexample for students, which Edmund Gettier came up with in the 1960s, counterexample to the tripartite theory of knowledge, right? Gettier says that, if you have knowledge, K, then the arrow goes over to JTB, to justified true belief. If you have knowledge, then you have, if knowledge, then justified true belief. But it's not the case that if you have justified true belief, then you have knowledge. And I think the skeptics would agree. That's what they've been trying to push, right? Just like Plato said, if you have knowledge, you have true belief. But it's not the case that if you have true belief, then you have knowledge. In other words, justified true belief is necessary for knowledge, but it's not sufficient for knowledge. And we've used that terminology in the past. Being a thought is necessary for being a belief, but it's not sufficient. Right? If you want to give a full definition of something, you give the necessary and the sufficient conditions for it. So if you have knowledge, obviously, it must be true, you must believe it, and your reasons must be of the right kind, right? But if you do have justified true belief, you might not have knowledge, Gettier said, and Lacewing's example will try and show that. Thus, it's probably the case that justified true belief alone is never knowledge. Right? When it seems to be knowledge, there's probably something else at work, unnoticed. Just like when true belief seemed to be knowledge, it was because we didn't notice what was in play. There was some kind of justification that was present. We just hadn't put our finger on it. Next slide. So Gettier's actual counterexample is kind of weird. He says, Sam has a strongly justifiable belief that Jones will get the job. Suppose that the boss told Sam he'd hire Jones. He's told Sam things like this before many times that were true. Suppose Sam knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket because he gave Jones 10 dimes for $1. He wanted it for a soda machine or something like that. Suppose Sam infers that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And he says, I know it. The person who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Right? Suppose it's true that Smith gets the job. Not Jones, right? And that Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, after the boss told Sam, the boss's wife, suppose, persuaded him to hire her brother Smith, and the boss hasn't had a chance to tell Sam, and coincidentally, Smith had 10 coins in his pocket, right? Now, it follows that Sam has a justified true belief that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in his pocket, because it turned out to be true, and he believed it, and he believed it for really good reasons, the right kinds of reasons. But reasons changed, and a coincidence happened, and another guy who had 10 coins in his pocket got the job in ways that were unanticipated, right? Sam doesn't know that to be true, though. It's a mere coincidence, right, that the person who got the job had 10 coins in his pocket, because if the other guy didn't have 10, it wouldn't have satisfied the truth condition. Right? It wouldn't be true that the guy who gets a job has 10 coins in his pocket. But the mere fact that it was true, that he believed it, and that he had justification for it, does not entail that he knows it. Therefore, having justified true belief does not guarantee you knowledge. And then, therefore, the three-part theory fails. The arrow only goes one way. Right? Okay, next slide. Lacewing's more intuitive counterexample. That example seemed a little hokey because of the coincidence and the inference involved about the 10 coins. It seems a little gimmicky. It's not representative of the kind of case like Plato had in mind, right? His counterexample. He says, okay, suppose that you have a justified true belief that your watch is on the nightstand because you always put it there. Unbeknownst to you, a burglar knocked it over, but put it right back where it was. Maybe because he saw it was a cheap watch. It wasn't worth taking, and he put it there in case you wake up before he's out of there. You'll see the watch there, right? So it's true. The watch is where you think it is. You believe it's true. You think it's there. And you have justification. You have a very good reason for it. It's been there every night for decades. You put it there last night. You remember putting it there. As far as you know, nothing happened to change that. But Lacewing would say, just like Gettier, you don't really know, right? If you're not looking at it at the moment. Or maybe you could alter the belief and say, I know that the watch was there all night. I put it there, no one was in the house, it's still there, whatever, right? You could have a justified true belief. Well, actually, if you said, I know that it was there all night, it would be false, because that's just not true. All right, but this is Lacewing's example. This is an attempt to undermine the justified true belief theories. Remember, you're only knocking down one arrow. If you have knowledge, it seems you have to have a justified true belief. But if you have a justified true belief, you might not have knowledge. Now, I say Plato really even got that, because the jury had a justified true belief. They believed that people swore an oath and said they told the truth. They had good evidence, right? They had a justified true belief, but they didn't have knowledge. So I think Plato maybe he didn't realize it, but maybe what he thought about with the account was that the account has to be, well, he said the justification is you need some kind of an account that connects your belief with the truth of the belief, right? And that doesn't happen in the Gettier case, right? And it doesn't happen with the watch case, right? So I don't know if Plato would accept these, right? All right, so we don't need to get too carried away, but I just thought we would talk about it, right? But just like true belief alone was necessary but not sufficient for Plato, in which case something else was needed, justification, so to justify true belief might be necessary but not sufficient, as per Gettier and Lacewing, in which case something else is needed. What could it be? A fourfold theory of knowledge? What could that be? A more specific interpretation or definition of justification? It's unclear how we might go about doing that. I'll talk about some possible fixes, okay? Seems like a matter of some, we're on the next slide, possible fixes to the JTB theory, the justified true belief theory. It seems like just a matter of semantics, wordplay, whether you want to call it a fourth criterion or just add it as a specific interpretation of justification. So that's one thing. It doesn't matter how you slice it, as a more carefully defined third criterion or a fourth criterion. Suppose the fix could be a causal criterion, right? The justification for the belief must be caused in some way by the truth of the belief, right? You could add that as a fourth criterion. It must be true, you must believe it, it must be justified, and the reasons why it's justified are causal, right? You have to say that the appropriate causal connection between your beliefs and the truth. Like I said earlier, if I perceive my shelf or my bookcase, my perception of it, which shows that it's there, is sufficiently justifying my belief, but also caused my belief. And that's the right kind of way for that belief to be caused and be justified, right? So that's one, a kind of causal criterion. Some other criteria, reliabilism, right? The method of justified belief formation must be reliable. For example, science is a reliable method for forming beliefs. Another one is called coherentism or holism. If all of your beliefs holistically cohere with each other, each one kind of explains and supports and grounds and gives evidence for the others, and they all interlock in a system, right? If that system justifies your beliefs, then that might be the difference. Foundationalism is another one. It could be related to the causal theory, but it's like your justification rests on direct support from solid epistemic foundations, right? Like sense perception, sensory data, direct immediate experience, right? That would be that's the foundation for your knowledge, right? That's one possible approach. Or that all of your epistemic, this is what comes out of Buddhist epistemology, your epistemic or cognitive apparatus, right? Your epistemic apparatus or cognitive equipment is reliable and functioning, and you used one of them. The word in Sanskrit is a pramana. You use a pramana to get the knowledge or the belief, then that's a kind of reliabilism and foundationalism and a causal theory all blended together. And then another one is just contextualism, which is what Hospers is talking about. Depends on the context, like the inflamed appendix, right? It's context dependent. So there are all those different possible ways of spelling out what justification is. But now, before we close, and that was the last slide, I just want to remind you what we did, right? We've done epistemology. We've looked at Cartesian skepticism, which Nagel also supported. The Pollock story about being a brain in a vat supported that. Descartes' first meditation, tremendous grounds for skepticism, right? This is the theory of knowledge. What makes something count as knowledge? That's epistemology. So we went from a twofold theory that Plato critiqued to a threefold theory. We got criticisms of that. But Hospers is using this analysis, which separates out knowing how and knowing by acquaintance to focus on propositions, right? As a way of countering skepticism. And my summary of all, very, very simple, is indubitability is a criterion for justification is too strong. Gullibility, oh, I saw a YouTube video on it. I saw a meme on Facebook, so it must be true. Or somebody had it written on their t-shirt. Those are too weak, right? That criterion is too weak, too gullible, right? If the gullible criterion is true, you know everything you ever think. That's false. If the indubitability criterion is correct, then if you could doubt anything, you don't know it. That's false, because if that was correct, we would know nothing at all, but we know a lot of things, and both of them get it wrong. This one says we don't know anything. That's wrong. This one says we know everything. That's wrong. The criterion is in the middle. We need adequate evidence and reasons. Similarly, before we get into this side is Descartes' doubt, doubts also need adequate evidence for them to be valid enough and strong enough to diminish your justification. That's the argument that I would make. All right, so that's the answer. I've solved the problem of skepticism. No. Philosophers are still arguing about this. All right, but I hope that we've got you thinking. Are you thinking yet? End of discussion for today.